Tenemos a Zara Paulina Martínez Sánchez. Ella nos va a presentar una ponencia que se titula Studying East Asian Genetics Ancestries in Peru based on migration from the late 16th and early 17th centuries.
Yeah. Okay, hi, it's a pleasure to be here. And today I will present the project I've been working on as an undergraduate student. So as an introduction, I can mention that most of the population genetic studies made with Latin American samples mention an admixture event between Africans, Europeans, and indigenous that occurred during the colonial period. This because this period began with the arrival of Europeans to America in the late 15th century, followed by the arrival of enslaved Africans in the early 16th century. But what about the arrival of Asians to America during this period of time? So if we want to answer this question, we must mention the Manila Galleon trade route. This began in 1565 and lasted until 1815. Twice a year, this trans-Pacific trade route connected the Philippines and New Spain, and one of its aims was to bring Asian goods to America, such as Chinese porcelains and silks. But also, this was the main route by which Asians came to America during the colonial period, most of them arriving at the port of Acapulco. Actually, in this study published last year, a Southeast Asian ancestry was observed in Mexicans from the port of Acapulco, suggesting a genetic legacy of the Manila Galleon. But this trade route did not end in New Spain, because from 1565 to 1633, there was a legal trade between New Spain and the Viceroyalty of Peru. Thus, part of the products brought to New Spain by the Manila Galleon were sent to the port of El Callao near the city of Lima in Peru. Also, there is a record of the presence of Asians in Lima at the beginnings of the 17th century. This, based on the census of Indians carried out in 1613 in the city of Lima. In this census, we can see that Asian migration to Peru, to Lima, began in the late 16th century. And also, some of these immigrants mentioned having arrived from New Spain after having traveled on the Manila Galleon. So inspired by all this information, we decided to study the Asian ancestry in Peru. The datasets that we used are the 1,000 Genomes Project Phase 3, and for the local ancestry inference, we also used the Human Genome Diversity Project dataset. After the quality control of the data, the first step was the use of admixture, a program for estimating ancestry from autosomal polymorphisms. After this, we saw that some Peruvian samples from Lima have more East Asian ancestry than the samples from the Puerto Rican and Colombian cohorts. The next step was the local ancestry inference, a technique that identifies the ancestry of each region of an individual's genome, as you can see in the picture. For this, we used nomics and a reference panel made with the African, indigenous, East Asian, and European cohorts. After the local ancestry inference in the Peruvian samples, the last step was the use of TRACTS algorithm for timing admixture events in Peru under different demographic scenarios. Here we tested two demographic models, one named as Single East Asian Pulse Model and the other as Two East Asian Pulse Model. As you can see, both models consider 3 admixture events that occurred in different times within the population. And also, the first admixture event is from European and indigenous ancestries. For the single pulse model, a migration pulse from African ancestry is modeled after the first admixture event and is followed by a migration pulse from East Asian ancestry. On the other hand, the two-pulse model considers a migration pulse from East Asian ancestry occurring at the same time as the African pulse, and then a second East Asian-related migration from East Asia. We did the model selection of these models based on the Bayesian information criterion score. So we run tracts with 2 datasets. One with those Peruvian individuals with over 4% of East Asian ancestry, and the other dataset with those individuals with less than 4% of East Asian ancestry. For both datasets, the best fit model was the Two East Asian Pulse model, and based on the distribution of tracts of continuous ancestry segments, the time for each migration pulse were inferred. So for the first admixture event, the inferred times were similar in both datasets, one in the mid-1600s and the other in the early 1600s. For the migration poles from African and East Asian ancestry, the inferred time for the first dataset was in the mid to late 1800s, and for the second dataset was in the early 1700s. And finally, for the second East Asian-related migration, the inferred time was in the early to mid-1900s for the first dataset, and for the second one was in the mid-1800s. So here we can see three different East Asian-related migrations in the population. So let's see what happened on each date based on historical records, so we can try to explain these results. And let's begin with the early 1700s. For this case, I couldn't find a record of Asian migration to Peru during this time, but we can take a look to the timeline of the trade between New Spain and Peru. As I mentioned before, this trade was legal until 1633, because a year later in 1634, was the trade ban. Despite this, in 1675 was the illegal trade reactivation, and between 1680 and 1730s were the years of splendor of the trade between New Spain and Peru before its decay in 1739. Thereby, the inferred time for the first East Asian-related migration coincides with the years of splendor of this trade. And in addition, the census of Lima, carried out in 1790, mentioned that 2.2% of the population of Lima had Chinese ethnicity, although it didn't mention how or when these people arrived to Peru. This is for the early 1700s. Now, for the other two dates, I can mention that in the mid to late 1800s was the Chinese immigration to Peru due to the country's need for labor, and in the early 1900s was the Japanese immigration to Peru after Peru and Japan established diplomatic relations. So the main ideas of this presentation are that there are historical records of Asian immigration to Peru since the colonial period, and also that based on the demographic models tested, 3 East Asian admixture events can be observed within the 1,000 genomes phase 3 dataset of Peruvians from Lima. As future perspectives are to determine the origin of the East Asian ancestries in Peru by performing an ancestry-specific multidimensional scaling with a reference panel from Asia using the samples of the Oceania genome variation and Peruvian datasets. So if anyone here can help us to get access to those datasets, we will appreciate that. And thanks for your attention, and thanks to all the people that helped me with it.
Thank you. Is there one question? Okay.
Thank you. Do you know if, by the way, great talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
It was super interesting. Do you know if there's historical records of the possible or place of origin of people that were like forced to move from East Asia? Is there any information that you could later corroborate, like exactly like you did right now, that you're creating historical records with genetics? Then your next step is to corroborate like the regional place of origin of these people that are coming, that you'd also corroborate it with historical records.
Yes, sure. The historical records say that most of the Asians that arrived to America were from China, Japan, Indonesia, Indochina, and Philippines.
Okay.
So with the ancestry, with the mass MDS, the ancestry-specific multidimensional scaling, we can see that
Right.
if that's correct, or where those people came to.
Thank you.
Population. Yes.
Is there one more question? No? Okay, thank you.